Hey, it's Mr. Shrum, and welcome back to a biology tutorial walkthrough. Today we're going to look at natural selection, and that ties back into evolution. And our objective is to explain how genetic variation, natural selection, and the environment lead to adaptations in organisms. So last time we looked at genetic variation, mutations, and how that led to speciation, new species from existing species, and how that enabled them to either survive or not survive. And this time we're going to look at natural selection. Next time we're going to look at the environment. So for a warm-up, the unusual patterns on a silk moth's wings are one of the most stunning examples of mimicry in the wild. And this mimicry occurs when an organism develops a physical characteristic or behavior similar to a protective trait in another species. So what do you think these moth wings mimic? Why do you think this kind of mimicry can protect the moth? And the sample answer here is the moth wings actually look like the eyes of a much larger animal. This mimicry may protect the moth from predators. So if a predator looks at this, they might interpret those large designs as large eyes of something that um, could be a threat to them. So it's trickery. It's very useful though. And the next warm-up question, what do you think genetic diversity means? How is it similar to or different from genetic variation? So genetic diversity is how much variation exists within a species. Genetic variation itself refers to the ability of traits to vary within a species. So genetic variation is how the traits can change within a species. So we're talking about different colors, different sizes. Genetic diversity is how much change, how much ability to change certain traits exists within a species. And we'll learn about that more in the lesson. Mechanisms of evolution. You've probably heard the phrase survival of the fittest, and this phrase is often paired with the theory of natural selection. The theory states that the organisms best adapted to survive in their environment have a higher chance of surviving to reproductive age and producing offspring than those who are less adapted. In addition to natural selection, many different mechanisms are involved in the evolutionary process. In the latter part of the 19th century, scientists developed theories on evolution to explain the variability in species, but they didn't yet know about genes. So the 19th century means the 1800s. This is still a little too early for genetic knowledge to be around. So they didn't know about genes, DNA, and chromosomes in the way that we do now. They did know that some traits seem to appear more often while others do not. We now know this phenomenon is the result of alleles. And alleles is the proper term. I'll let you guys hear the correct pronunciation. Read aloud.
Alleles.
Allele. So allele, and we know how dominant genes and recessive genes control outward traits. Dominant, again, means an allele that can suppress the expression of another allele, recessive genes, an allele that can be blocked by a dominant gene. So now, this survival of the fittest, I believe, should be rephrased as survival of the fit. And that means how you fit in with the rest of your surroundings. Because it has to be a delicate balance between you and the other species in a certain biome. Ecology is based on mutualism, a certain give and take. And if one thing is disrupted or you're too aggressive in some cases, you will disrupt the circle of life and the ecological balance in a certain region. And that could have negative consequences for your species as well. So it's not always the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the fit. Species can work together to survive in a certain um, area, not to dominate one another. The Hardy-Weinberg principle, before scientists even knew what genes were, they were already developing theories about population genetics. In 1906, we have scientists Jeffrey Hardy and Wilhelm Weinberg independently concluded that the frequency of genes stays constant in a population unless some mechanism of change occurs. They theorized that without forces of change, evolution does not occur, and a population of organisms is at genetic equilibrium. Scientists named this theory the Hardy-Weinberg principle. Got some pigs. Hardy and Weinberg developed an equation to predict the frequencies of the alleles within all the organisms of a species inhabiting a particular area at a given time. The equation is called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation. Let's explore how this equation works. Consider a population of 100 sweet pea plants. 45 plants are homozygous dominant for a particular trait caused by dominant genes. So what that means is homozygous means they have the same TT and it's dominant. That's why they're capital TT. And homozygous means the same trait is doubled. So this is two capitals. This is one capitalized, one dominant, and one recessive. And that is called heterozygous. And then we have 20 plants that are homozygous recessive. So they have both recessive. So these have homozygous dominant, both are dominant. Heterozygous is one dominant, one recessive. Homozygous recessive is both recessive. So now among the 45 homozygous dominant plants, 90 are T alleles. So 45 times 2. In the heterozygous group, 35 are capital T alleles and 35 are recessive alleles. So we have 90 dominant alleles in the first group, 35 dominant alleles in the second group, and then all of the group in the last group is recessive alleles. So if you tally everything up, if you tally all of the dominant and the recessive, we get 90 plus 35 plus 35 plus 40. The total number of dominant alleles is 125. The total number of recessive alleles is 75. And together we have 200 alleles. So if you put those in a fraction, you put the number of dominant alleles divided by the total number of alleles, that would be 125 divided by 200. That gives you 0.625. You can also do that with the recessive allele frequency. We have 75 divided by 200. So it's the number of a certain allele divided by the total number of alleles. Now assume that P represents the dominant allele frequency and Q represents the recessive allele frequency. Because there are only two forms of the allele, adding the two frequencies will result in 100% of the population. So what that means is 0.625 plus 0.375 gets you 1, and that is 100%. Now we can modify this equation to calculate the frequency of each genotype. And the genotype is the genetic makeup of the organism for a particular trait. Squaring both sides of the equation, the new equation is p plus q squared equals 1. And if you factor that out, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1, where homozygous dominant is equal to p squared. So this, you see how this is starting to look like what we had on the other page. So this can be seen as p squared. This is 2 times p times q, and this is q squared. So p squared is the homozygous dominant, the 2pq is heterozygous, and the homozygous recessive is q squared. And if you plug all that in, all the frequencies in from the previous page, where p equals 0.625 and q equals 0.375, you plug all that in, we get 1. So the values that are added together are the equilibrium frequencies of each genotype. Okay. And here we have an example for you to work out. I'll show you the sample answer. So we have 100 plants. Red flowers are dominant, yellow flowers are recessive. F is the dominant allele, and lowercase f is the recessive allele. So 40 plants are homozygous dominant. Homozygous dominant means both are dominant alleles. Heterozygous means one's dominant, one's recessive. Homozygous recessive means both are recessive. Now we're going to use that equation to calculate the equilibrium frequencies of each genotype. So this 40 times 2 will give us 80 dominant alleles. Then we have 44 times 2, or what, sorry, 44 F and 44 F recessive. Yeah, there we go. And then this will give us, sorry about that, 16 times 2 equals 32 F recessive. Okay. So, and then we'll look down here to show you. Yeah, this will be easier to see. So the genotype of the homozygous dominant will be capital FF, and the total number of the dominant alleles will be 80. Here's the heterozygous plant types in the genotype for the homozygous recessive. Now, the total number is just adding that up, okay? So 80 plus 44, 80 plus 44 plus 44 plus 32, that is 200, okay? And a simple way to remember that is that, well, there's 100 plants and there's 2 alleles. So 100 times 2 equals 200. And that is the total number of alleles. Now the frequency is the number of the allele divided by the total number of alleles. And if we're looking at just the dominant allele, we have 124. We get that by adding up 80 and 44. So that's just adding up the dominant allele number. That's 124 over 200. And that gives us 0.62 frequency. The frequency of the recessive allele will be 76. And 76 is from 44 plus 32. So 76 over the total number of alleles is 200. That equals 0.38. And now if you plug that into our equation, p squared plus 2 times p times q plus q squared, we have 0.62 for p and 0.38 for q. If you add all that up, we have the equations, or we have the equilibrium frequencies for each genotype. And that means we have 0.62 times 0.62, that equals 0.3844 for the dominant homozygous frequency. Then we have the heterozygous frequency is 2 times 0.62 times 0.38. That equals 0.4712. And the homozygous recessive frequency is from 0.38 times 0.38, and that is 0.1444. So if you look at this equation, that first part will give you the equilibrium frequency for the homozygous dominant. Then we have this second part that'll give us the heterozygous. Then we have the homozygous recessive frequency in that third part. Now, genes and evolution. Several forces of change contribute to the mechanism of evolution, and we're going to examine some of those factors first. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is the process by which allele frequencies of a population change over generations as a result of random events. All populations experience genetic drift, but small populations are at a higher risk of losing a gene. In small populations, genetic drift can result in an evolutionary change in the species. Larger populations tend to be more stable. A change in the allele frequency doesn't significantly impact their genetic equilibrium altogether. So let's look at two ways in which genetic drift can cause an evolutionary change in small populations. So we have the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. Founder effect occurs when a small set of population separates from the larger population. The smaller population tends to have a lower genetic variation and evolved separately from the larger population. So you look here, look how varied it is as a whole from the original population. And then this small population starts evolving separately, and they're resembling less and less like they're resembling the original population less and less. Look at the frequency of blues and purple compared to here. Now, the bottleneck effect occurs when a large genetically diverse population suddenly experiences some catastrophic event and declines to a very low number. The few surviving members can reproduce, but because the population is smaller, there is a lower degree of genetic variation. So here, northern elephant seals are an example of a bottleneck effect in a species' evolutionary history. So in the late 1800s, northern elephant seals almost became extinct because of hunting. Biologists estimate that the lowest population was about 20 individuals that survived on Guadalupe Island, west of Baja California. From that small group of survivors, they rebounded to 30,000. But evidence of the drop in genetic variation still exists in their genome. So here's the parent population with significant genetic variation. Bottlenecking event that could be hunting. So humans have a tendency to make species go extinct or endanger lots of species for various reasons. So that will lower the numbers so much that when those members don't go extinct, but they have to build back their population, their degree of genetic variation is just not the same. Look how less diverse they are. And this can also happen to humans, and to some degree, there's evidence that it's happened to our common ancestors as well. But say, I mean, lots of movies and video games they focus on that, like post-apocalyptic, or what if there's a thermonuclear war? Uh, Lots of the population are wiped out, and then society has to build anew. What would that look like? Well, it would likely look, the people wouldn't be as genetically diverse as we are right now. Gene flow. Gene flow can happen when organisms migrate and successfully reproduce. So, in the process, new genes enter the population or existing genes leave the population. Gene flow is high in species that travel or migrate. Think of um, birds or insects sometimes. And for examples, bed bugs tend to travel via people's luggage in airplanes and cars. This migration enables them to mate with distant and unrelated mates. So, unfortunately, pests like this um, are able to mate over long distances. And let me click on that. Okay. Mutations. Mutations are yet another force that can change the genetic makeup of organisms. Mutations are changes in the genetic structure, and they can occur randomly. Occasionally, mutations will lead to a beneficial trait. Organisms with these mutations may have a better chance of surviving and reproducing. Over time, more or all of the species in an area can have the same mutation. So, honeybees aid in gene flow through the transfer of pollen from one flower to another. So this is an example of mutualism or some mutual benefit. This species interaction helps one another. Non-random mating. In most species, mating is not completely random. Organisms tend to mate with a partner that lives in the same region. Often, organisms choose partners with similar physical traits as themselves. In extreme cases, non-random mating may lead to not interbreeding, inbreeding, and resulting in a decrease in genetic diversity. The population tends to become more homozygous, and inbreeding can also increase harmful traits in the population. Inbreeding in a species is an indicator of a poor chance of survival of the species. So less diversity in your population means a lower chance of survival overall. So that is not ideal. So here we have a video about natural selection in plate tectonics. The movement of the plates can contribute to the natural selection of organisms. What is another natural process that could contribute to the evolution of a species' genomes? How would this process affect evolution? So a sample example answer here is a natural disaster, So think earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, could affect the evolution of a species' genome. Disasters can kill large numbers of organisms all at once. It could decrease the genetic variation in their gene pool. And in some cases, large populations may become separated, which can lead to several smaller populations evolving in different ways. So now let me click on that video, share the computer sound, turn on the captions. It should be good. Really.
It's in tropical forests, as here in Indonesia, that you find the richest diversity of life anywhere on Earth. The origins of all this diversity was a mystery that obsessed Victorian naturalists when they returned from their collecting trips with exotic animals and plants. The answer finally came from two great scientists. One was Charles Darwin, the other a lesser-known Englishman working in these forests in the 1850s, Alfred Russel Wallace. I've always felt a particular affinity for Wallace. He was a professional collector, but he so obviously took a delight in the natural world, and he loved its amazing variety. He writes in his journals of how he trembled with excitement as a particularly beautiful butterfly got into his net, and he rhapsodizes several times about the beauties of the birds of paradise. It was here he developed his theory, identical to Darwin's, about the origin of species through natural selection. The idea that as individuals compete for space and resources, selection, acting over many generations, picks out those that are best adapted to live in their environment. Although it was Darwin who developed these ideas most completely, Wallace added a significant extra twist to the theory. He noticed that this narrow strait between the islands of Bali and Lombok marked a dramatic changeover in the types of animals and plants he was finding in Indonesia. Lombok was inhabited by species which were common in Australia. But in Bali, there was an unexpected changeover to plants and animals much closer to those found throughout Southeast Asia. Wallace was puzzled because the two islands were only 15 miles apart. Then he made a bold intellectual leap. In a letter which he wrote to Darwin in 1858, he said, "Facts like these can only be explained by the bold acceptance of enormous changes in the Earth's surface." And we know he was absolutely right. He can't have had any idea of the mechanism, but we know now that Lombok and the points to the east and Bali and points to the west were on separate plates, thousands of miles apart, and only by continental drift have they been brought this close together. "80 million years ago, the Australian region was much further to the south. But the plate carrying Australia and nearby islands with their distinctive wildlife was moving gradually northwards. Eventually, they were brought closer and closer to Southeast Asia to form the Indonesian archipelago.
Okay. So that is one example of natural events affecting the development of genetic variation and natural selection. Natural selection is another important mechanism that contributes to the evolutionary process. Scientists have identified some clear trends in the way natural selection functions. Disruptive selection, in disruptive selection, the species tends to split into two different groups. Natural selection favors the extremes in the phenotypes, and organisms with intermediate phenotypes decrease in number. Consider a butterfly species with several color phenotypes, including two that mimic species of butterflies that are toxic to predators. This mimicry and coloring gives these butterflies a survival advantage. So the population of these two phenotypes rise while the existing mean color trait decreases. So this is the original one, and then these two extreme phenotypes, if they help survive, the population of those will rise while the existing current original population decreases, since they are less adaptable. Directional selection. This occurs when natural selection favors one extreme version of the phenotype that increases the organism's chance of survival. This selection causes the genetic distribution to shift in one direction. For example, during the Industrial Revolution, lichens provided camouflage to black and white speckled peppered moths. The moths rested on trees where the lichens grew. Smoke from factories turned these trees black, killing the lichens and exposing the peppered moths to predators. A mutation caused some moths to have black pigmentation, leading to directional selection. These black moths escaped predation, survived, and reproduced. This mutation spread in the species, and for a while, almost all moths in the area were black. Stabilizing selection. The most common form of natural selection is stabilizing selection, which favors the intermediate phenotype. There is a decrease in the number of organisms exhibiting the extremes of the phenotype. The species evolves, leading to a narrower range of traits. Human birth size is an example of stabilizing selection. Babies that are too small have an increased risk of death. Babies that are too large may endanger the life of the mother or be a risk to themselves. So the range of human birth weight has narrowed over time. So this shows the original population. And then after natural selection, the range of newborn baby weight has narrowed because that is the most ideal. But individual cases of extremes in the phenotype may still occur. You still do get a baby that is extremely small down here and a baby that is extremely large down here. But for the most part, it has stabilized between those two extremes. Sexual selection. This occurs most often when there are physical differences between the male and the female of a species. It occurs when individuals choose mates based on desired characteristics. For example, female birds often choose male birds that have the brightest coloring. So some males have a higher chance of reproduction than others. Over time, the feature that attracted the females to mates becomes more common. Here we have a natural selection in populations activity. So we're given a set of data to analyze and interpret about a population. A scientist has been monitoring the height of a small population of wild sheep for 30 years. He monitored 200 adult male sheep from each year and then broke down the height into ranges. So let's see if we can use this to answer the questions below. So take this data and make a bar chart, and I'll show you the end result. This is a bar chart. We have the data from 30 years ago is blue, and the data from present day is in red. And we group them into these four groups: under 1 meter, between 1 and 1.19 meters, between 1.2 and 1.4 meters, and greater than 1.4 meters. And on the x-axis, we have the height. This is the independent variable and the dependent variable, number of individuals. So x-axis, y-axis. B, the researchers think that changes in data are a result of selection. Do you think directional, disruptive, or stabilizing selection is occurring? The graph shows a shift to one particular extreme. Larger body size is being selected over smaller body size. This situation is an example of directional selection. So if you look at the old data, look at the blue, you can see that most were in the 1 to 1.19 meter section. And yet we see that over time in present day, you have more moving to this 1.2 to 1.4 meters. So there's more number of individual sheep that are taller than 1.19 than previously. So over time, it's shifting to larger bodies. What percentage of sheep had a body height of 1.2 meters or more 30 years ago? How does it differ from the present data? Does this data support your argument regarding the type of selection occurring? So how you do this is you would add up the 30 years ago in these two sections. So we have 40 plus, I want to say maybe 5. So 45 45 out of a total of 200. So that adds up to 200. We have, there we go, 45 out of 200 individuals were taller than 1 meters more than 30 years ago. And that's about 22.5%, were at least 1.2 meters tall. And that was looking at the blue from 30 years ago. Now we're going to look at the present data. So we have maybe 75 plus 25. Presently, 50.5% of individuals are at least 1.2 meters tall. Meanwhile, individuals below 1.2 meters in height have decreased significantly between the 2 years of data. This data supports the argument that directional selection is actually occurring. The researcher also collected height data from 200 female sheep during both years, but didn't notice a significant difference in height. What could this data suggest? The process of natural selection acts on height only in male sheep at this point. This scenario may be caused by sexual selection. Females are choosing taller mates for reproduction, leading to an increased likelihood that their offspring will inherit these genes. All right, so we'll stop there for today and pick up on natural selection and adaptations next time. But if you have any questions, be sure to message me on Canvas or email me, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. All right, take care. See you guys.